With that, I'm going to welcome back Mike Engleson, the Executive Director with Wisconsin Lakes. One of the things he's been working on lately and getting lots of phone calls on is some challenges related to recreational use impacts to Wisconsin Lakes, and he's here to share with us some of that information. So welcome back, Mike.
Thanks for having me back, Patrick. Starting and ending with me. I don't know what that says for all of you, and I know you've been assaulted with a lot of information this morning. This has been a lot of really great talks. So I will try to keep this pretty high level and fairly brief so that we can get you on to your meetings. One of the things that Wisconsin Lakes has really identified as a priority, it's really the priority issue that we're working on right now, probably over the next couple or if not more years, is this the increase of recreational use impacts on our lakes. And I'll get into exactly what we're doing about it at the end of this talk. But as Patrick said, we've received, and I continue to receive, multiple phone calls and emails every day of different aspects of different recreational use impacts that we're really seeing outsized impacts over the last couple of years. I think it helps to take a step back. Oh, and before I get into it, I should mention, I put in the chat a link to our Thursday at 4 webinar series page. This was a series of webinars that Eric Olson and I co-hosted in the spring on a whole bunch of different topics. This talk that I'm doing right now is distilled from a talk that I gave then. It was I think it was the very last talk. So if you go to that page and scroll down to the bottom, you can watch that, especially the stuff I'm going to talk about carrying capacity. I talk about that in more detail in that talk. And there's a bunch of other topics there. We'll be restarting that in the fall, so pay attention for that. There's my little shameless plug for our webinar series. So what do we talk about when we talk about recreational use of lakes? Based on the contacts that I've gotten, I think that for a lot of people, you're thinking about wake boats, especially because that's sort of the outsized impacts. Those are the watercraft that are causing the most outsized impacts, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But we have to really, I think it's important that as we think about that issue and how it impacts our lakes, we keep in mind all the other things that are recreational use impacts. So there's on-water things like swimming and fishing and jet skis and just general power boats and water skiing, but there are also all the off-water impacts that I'm really not going to be able to have time to get into today, but that are important as well and impact things like water quality and some of the environmental issues that we'll be looking at with some of the on-water activities. So even residential development, though that's maybe not something that you would normally think of as causing recreational impacts, if you have more people living on a water body for longer periods of time, they're naturally going to be doing more. And there are all the sorts of so that's going to have, true recreational impacts. And then there are all the shoreline impacts that previous speakers have talked about today. So I think it's important to think about residential development and short-term home rentals, even campgrounds, even just people coming to parks and using the beach on a day use basis. All of these sorts of things kind of fit into that recreational use category. But as far as on the water impacts, we know that that in the past few years, the number of boats has increased on Wisconsin waters. Certainly in the last year, and most researchers, I think, believe that is partly a pandemic effect in that people didn't have anywhere to go, so they were going outside, so they went and bought a boat. There's definitely an impact that the border with Canada is shut down for the most part, so people are not going to Canada to fish. They probably are sticking closer to home. Maybe they're, instead of going from Chicago up into the provinces, they're coming up into the Northwoods instead. So on the screen, you can see some statistics. I won't read them, but that prove that point that boat sales have gone up. I think it's interesting to note that in 2011, we actually had 629,000 boats registered in Wisconsin, as opposed to 621 in 2020. So, Do we definitely know that we have more boats than we did? That points maybe in a different direction, or maybe it just is an indication that a lot of those extra boats are coming in from out of state, which has implications as well. So I divide the recreational impact into a couple of different main categories. Personal, there's the personal impact. So things like safety, that's pretty obvious. Does the impact hurt people? Could it hurt people? There's the level of frustration that it causes. So as recreational use increases, people get more frustrated with being on a water body. It's harder to kayak, it's harder to water ski. Maybe they go someplace else at some point, and then it moves into a displacement. So it's actually moving recreational uses around to different lakes or different water bodies because of the increase of recreational impact on one of them. And then there are, of course, the obvious ecological and environmental problems. It might be in-water habitat, it might be water quality, and underlying or maybe laying on top of all of this is the problems with aquatic invasive species. So I think a good way of framing this is to think we obviously have this problem we know with enhanced wakes from wake boats and other activity, but I want to first talk about this concept of carrying capacity. That's basically the idea of whether or not there are too many watercraft, or what is the right number of watercraft for a particular lake. And I think it's important to look at that first, because if you're on a lake where your carrying capacity is already exceeded or is getting close to, you might have a different calculus of how you want to approach solving the problem than if you're just on a lake with a couple of people who are operating wake boats in a way that's causing damage. Those are two completely different situations. And with this increased amount of traffic, thinking about carrying capacity is important. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I do want to point out a couple of references that I think are important. And this first one is a paper by Lowell, who is sort of the founder of the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. In 1994, he wrote something called Load Limits for Lakes. It's kind of a manifesto to think about this idea of carrying capacity. And it's kind of amazing how still relevant what he says is to what's going on today. As far as sort of the gold standard, at least in Wisconsin, for carrying capacity studies, Lake Ripley did a study in the early 2000s, and it's available. Some of the results are talked about in their lake management plan that you can get through their website. So what exactly do I mean by carrying capacity? Generally, in most of the studies that I've looked at, it's defined as something like this: the number of watercraft that can simultaneously operate on the lake without compromising user safety, causing significant user displacement or dissatisfaction, or causing environmental harm. So you can see how the way I framed recreational impacts, you can see those sort of recognized in this idea of carrying capacity. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing. These studies are extremely technical. There's a lot of data collection that's involved, but they really boil down to basically a couple of steps that I think can be kind of done on a back of the envelope calculation by pretty much any lake that will help you determine, like, if you're in the zone of, okay, maybe we do really need to start thinking about that. And the first step is to determine how many acres you have for recreational use. We're really talking about boating at anything above a no wake speed. So should be fairly simple to determine this on most lakes. You just subtract out the 100-foot ring around the shore because that's already designated as slow no wake for all motorcraft. Of course, it's 200 feet if you're talking about personal watercraft, but for simplicity's sake, you can say you can take out that first 100-acre ring. And then you might want to subtract out any areas that either are already protected or need protection because they're shallow or sensitive or something like that. Using this very simple example of a perfectly round lake, you subtract out that 100-foot Snow Lake area, and you really only have 38.7 acres of a 50-acre lake that are available for anything above no wake transit. So then you look at, okay, so you have that many. How many boats doing different kinds of activities can you have on the lake at a time? And this is where in a rigorously scientific study, you do a bunch of collect a bunch of data, do censuses, not sure what the plural of that is, but you would do multiple censuses to determine, like, on particular days at particular times, what's the kind of activity going on. Because there have been some other studies that have determined what are called spatial requirement estimates for various types of watercraft that basically say for fishing, you need about 10 acres, for water skiing, you need about 30 acres per boat, something like that. And then you can develop sort of a sliding scale for your lake. Lake Ripley came down with about 10 to 30 acres per boat. So if you're fishing, you really only need 10, like I said, 30 for a more active thing. If you have a lake that really only is mostly just fished, then your carrying capacity might be based on 10 to 15 acres. But if you have multiple uses like Lake Ripley does, you might go with 10 to 30. That's where it gets kind of, this is where it's a little more speculative, and the back of your envelope calculation might not be completely accurate, but generally, most of the studies I've looked at have come in around 10 to 30 acres per boat. So what that means is that on your very small 50-acre lake, if you have more than one boat traveling at high speed, you may have exceeded your carrying capacity. Or if you have more than 3 people out fishing on that lake, you may have exceeded your carrying capacity. And you can take that out, obviously, to larger size lakes. What this does is it kind of helps you determine, so, okay, if we know we have too many watercraft, or we're approaching the point where we think we have too many watercraft on a lake, then we know we have to do something more than just target the activity that we're having a problem with. We might actually have to target multiple activities, or look at solutions that really kind of dampen that the number of boats that are on the lake to the extent that you can. Okay, so we've talked about carrying capacity. Now let's talk about wakes themselves, because we know this is a topic of great concern and definitely is having probably the largest recreational use impact that we're seeing having increased in the state in the last couple of years. First of all, keep in mind that just the fact that there's more traffic on the lake is going to mean more waves, and that's going to mean more impacts. So there's just the lake is more active itself just because there's more stuff going on it. And that's something important to consider. But when you have devices that make the wakes and the waves even bigger, like wake boats or other craft that are modified to enhance those wakes, that's just an additional problem. We see problems of personal safety. And for any of you who have contacted me on this, these are all things I'm sure that you have brought up. We know that enhanced wakes can impact personal safety, property damage, they cause shoreline damage, they can cause damage to the lake bottom, and there are definite worries about aquatic invasive species transfer in the way that these deep, larger wakes are generated using ballast tanks that drive sterns into the water more. Those tanks may not drain as well. So there's potential for AIS transfer there, also just more complicated machinery. If you're interested, well, let me get into what we're going to do about this. I'll tell you about this study in a second. So overlying all of this, of course, is this idea in Wisconsin that we have a constitutional mandate to protect our waters for the use of everyone in the state, called the public trust doctrine. I won't go into detail on that. You can probably seen this before, but it's literally enshrined in the Constitution, and it's constitutional provision. So in load limits, Lowell, I just want to make sure that you take into account these two quotes. And remember, he wrote this in 1994. So he says, without legislated restraint, democratically adopted free public resources like water are inevitably trampled by too many users, by a single well-organized user group, or by technology that simply overwhelms other uses and sometimes destroys the natural resource itself. Sounds kind of familiar. The importance placed on the public trust doctrine has also led some users to feel they have a right to any use on any lake at any time. They extrapolate the right of access to the water and extend it to any activity their equipment might allow them to perform. So we have some people that have argued that doing something that it's totally against the public trust doctrine to try to control numbers of boats that are on the lake, or to control what the type of boat is or what they're doing. I'd put forth that's probably not really true, because we would not probably allow this boat on Big Green Lake, even though it might fit. I think there are limits to where we would say that's not really probably what we want to do. And so I think we want to keep the public trust doctrine in mind, but Lowell set out some goals that we want to look at in terms of how we're looking at recreational use. Aesthetic opportunity, the ability to enjoy the water body. If there's too much going on, or the wake boat or some other watercraft is destroying the moment for others, that needs to get weighed. Recreational opportunity, does everybody have a chance to do the recreation that they're looking to do? Environmental security, are we protecting the water body, water quality, habitat, shoreline, all of that? And then all of the economic opportunity that comes around because of that, because of all the tourism and the money that people spend on recreation. So as Wisconsin Lakes, we decided that the important thing for us to do is to not just focus on wake boats as an issue, but take a look at all of these things for a number of different reasons. And we came up with kind of 4 key components that we're looking at. The first, we want to promote good research and understanding through scientific studies, and understand how to use social science to help change boater behavior where necessary. So there's a great study that is I hope it's a great study, at least, because I haven't seen any of the results of it, but it's from the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory at the University of Minnesota. It's very, very rigorously done, that will look at the impact of enhanced wakes on I believe most aspects of the lake environment, so both shoreline and the lake bottom. There are a number of studies from around the country that are maybe more focused on a particular lake or area that have been instructive. And there's one in Wisconsin that was done, is in process by the people at the North Lake Management District in Southeast Wisconsin. They've done a couple of presentations on their use of drone technology to show impacts both above and below the water from different types of watercraft, creating different kind of wakes. You can see those, they presented at Wisconsin Water Week. So there's a presentation in the archives there, and then also the Northwest Wisconsin Lakes Conference. All of those videos should be available on the Extension Lakes YouTube page. So we want to support science because we want to make sure that we have good data to back the arguments that we're making. In the meantime, while we wait for that science to catch up, we want to continue to do the kind of lake user education so that people understand their impacts, you know, in the way that we have done with Healthy Lakes and the way we've done with Clean Boats, Clean Waters. There are programs called Own Your Own Wake that the Minnesota DNR has done and has partnered with Wisconsin in the West some. Education is still important. It's a great thing. It's an important thing to build understanding between user groups, and it's important because there are users that just don't know and will change their behavior if they are educated. Of course, there's going to be those 1 or 2 that cause problems, and that's where local management and enforcement comes in. That's a topic for a whole different talk, what you can actually do. But I see this as the most important, at least in the short term, way to sort of help move things along, that localities look at their own lakes and figure out what will work for them. There are some potential statewide solutions, but there really is no good one size fits all for this, whether you're talking about wake boats or anything else. And so ultimately, I think it's going to be on the hands of local municipalities and lake districts that are able to do ordinance work, that are going to be able to really make some changes for their own water bodies. Those, of course, efforts have to be backstopped by strong and supportive statewide policies. And that's where a group like Wisconsin Lakes comes in. We're going to, help try to get statewide regulations passed where appropriate. We want to help make sure that local control doesn't get lost, where funding opportunities are happening is important. But always remember, we're in a state right now of politics where not much gets done. So it's really going to end up being kind of hard. So what can you do? Document your local situation, start a conversation with other lake stakeholders. If you can find boating groups in your area, start talking to them, just politely. It's not an adversarial thing, but sometimes they don't know that there are problems. And then you can help support our efforts to try to get all of that done. Boom. Threw a lot at you there, but thanks for the time. And I put my email address in the chat, and I'm certainly willing to talk with people one-on-one later on as well.
Great stuff, Mike. Thank you for your work.